The kinds of projects I'm going to be showing today, although I have done buildings, I'm not going to be showing any buildings today. I'm going to be showing what I call experiments, what could actually be considered experiments with a palette of colors rather than a finished painting. I'm going to go through about 7 projects, and each of them should not be necessarily considered as a finished work, but rather something that's moving towards eventually, perhaps, if I make it to my 50s, something more coherent, if you like. I've called the talk towards an ephemeral architecture because I'm interested in the notion of architecture that exists in this moment. In other words, it's not something that's static, immutable, and changing, but rather in an architecture which is always changing, that is only ever in existence at the moment that somebody is in it. So rather than thinking about traditional architecture, which is about architecture, about walls, roofs, ceilings, floors, this is the way we traditionally thought about architecture. I'm much more interested at the moment in what goes on inside. If you like, what might be called the software space rather than the hardware. And so some of these experiments have actually gone through to look at the ways that we might talk about architecture in terms that are explicitly time-based, that are explicitly perception-based, and which are not just about bricks and concrete and things like that. This image basically sums up what most interests me at the moment. It's the same piglets, the same box, but on the right-hand side, the temperature has been raised by 4 degrees. And so a very small change in what you might call the software of the space has dramatically changed the way the bodies inside relate to each other, but also the way they relate to space. They've transformed, if you like, their social relationships just by changing this so-called software. So this is really the kind of thing that I'm interested in at the moment, and each of the experiments goes through looking at how we can have some effect on this software of architecture. The first project I'll talk about is from 2001. It's called Sense of Space. And it was a project about a way to use smell in architectural space. Because smell is not really often used in a coherent way in architecture because it's so difficult to control. In other words, if I had some natural smell output system out here on stage, if I wanted to have some effect from the smell system, it would rapidly fill up the entire place because smell is it's very difficult to actually deal with in a predictable manner, if you like. Smell has been used in design spaces predominantly in 2 ways. One is in marketing. In other words, you've probably heard about the story of the way some supermarkets pump the smell of bread in a shop and it entices people in. The second way that smell has been used is in branding. And so I think there's a hotel chain that has invented or produced smell which is used in all of their lobbies throughout the world and supposedly makes one feel as though one has encountered this space before. In Sense of Space, we wanted to develop a system that enabled us to use smell itself to create ephemeral zones and boundaries that could actually be controlled. And so what we did, basically, was build a very slow-moving wind tunnel. At this end, the air is pushed in. It goes through a series of diffusion screens and comes into this central area where the people are standing, where the air is basically moving about this speed, about 0.2 meters per second. This is slow enough that it doesn't make you feel like wind, you don't actually feel a breeze. But because it's laminar airflow, which means that all the air is moving in straight lines, we can actually inject scent at any point in that stream, and it will continue to flow in a perfectly straight line. And if you stagger it, if you switch on and off, then you can start to create cubes or rectangles of smell. Now, one thing I quite like about smell is that it's actually so difficult to photograph. You can't do video. You just see a person walking around in this empty space, and you might see this in a few of my projects, but I like to do things that can't really be photographed. We did make a mistake, which was that we put some bad smells down low where only kids could smell them. Kids really didn't have a great time. Basically, we had a couple of different versions of this, and one of them we tried to create the smell you might encounter in the city. So we had the smell of rubbish, coffee, grass, ozone, rubber, these kinds of things. So that was the project which I think was the sort of first step into looking at ways that something ephemeral could reprogram the way we associate space. And the really interesting thing for me was that smell is something that each of us perceives in so completely different ways. There are some people who walked into the chamber and thought it was a gas chamber or something, We're really taken aback by how powerful the scent was in there. Other people walked in there and, were wondering, what is it? There's nothing happening in here. Am I just is this a sort of a emperor with no clothes kind of situation? And it really drove home the point that our perception is subjective, but also that we construct our perceptions ourselves. Our perceptions of space, and so perception later on in these projects becomes a lot more important. Sky Theater actually started in Japan in 2000 when I was in my studio, and I was trying to get mobile phones thinking. And if I walked to one end of my studio, then I could make a phone call. If I walked to the other end of the studio, I couldn't make a phone call. And I began to realize that there was this sort of electromagnetic topography, if you like, in my studio, which I couldn't physically perceive through my own body, but which was affecting the way I used the space in much the same way that walls and doors and corridors do. And so what I did was I took my mobile phone, and you know how you have the antenna bar, and you can count out the signal strength, and I just walked 1 meter, and I started to plot out diagrams of this, what I came to call the Hertzian topography of the space. Now, it occurred to me that this Hertzian invisible topography, if you like, is changing quite dramatically over time, but it also changed in three-dimensional space. And so, one thing I decided to do was basically make some kind of system that could actually rise up towards the sky and carve out an area of this electromagnetic space and give me some kind of idea of what the texture of this electromagnetic space might actually be like. And so I planned to build a very large sensor array, I guess you could call it, and it's about 40 meters across. It's made up of 1,000 helium balloons. Inside each helium balloon is a sensor that's responding to electromagnetic fields. And since I'm not interested only in sensor arrays, but actually in let's say, creating electromagnetic fields, I decided to embed this cloud, if you will, with 37 mobile phones. And so the idea was that this thing would rise up into the sky, responding to the electromagnetic fields,